Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalrim. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at tanks for BFA. Now, I've done a couple of videos, one talking about casters for DPS, as well as agility DPS, and I have a couple more videos coming out, and this is one of those videos in the series. And in this video, we're going to put our eyeglass over the tank specializations in BFA. One of the ways that Blizzard is approaching tanks in BFA is trying to kind of homogenize them, and while not a lot of us are happy when classes just get almost created in a copy-paste fashion where they just play very similar, Blizzard is homogenizing tanks so that you don't have the worst and the best tanks, or at least the gap is not as bad. You could say, for example, let's say Demon Hunter is the best raiding tank. They just have the best utility and they're simply the strongest. And then you have Bear Druid that for, I'd say, a certain amount of time in patches are just in a terrible position. And tanks are so difficult to fine-tune, as the guy that takes the least amount of damage, has the most amount of aggression, has the best defenses, and maybe even the best survivability on their own, and mobility might end up taking the lead. And let's say Demon Hunter has all these things while a Bear Druid doesn't. That's what Blizzard's trying to homogenize a lot of the tanks, so they're a lot closer to each other. So when you go into a dungeon, or a Mythic Plus, or a raid, and you see a warrior, a bear, maybe a monk going into the dungeon, you will really just take the class as well as the player's skill into consideration. Like, what does the class offer you for your team, as well as how good is the player, rather than, oh, let's take the flavor of the month class and not the bad class. For this reason alone, we're going to be taking a look at the tanks, not in terms of numbers, not in terms of biggest defensives, because all these things can be tuned. We're not going to look at the best health or the most amount of AoE damage they can put out, but rather in terms of playstyle. Do they feel fun? Do they feel interactive? Do they have a lot of thought process going on or very little? Do they have a lot of mobility or not a lot? What do I like about these tanks and what do I not like about them? And there's a lot to talk about when it comes to every single tank spec in the game. And tanking is something that I have been doing on the side when it comes to Legion. Whenever I made my warrior for EU, I actually picked up warrior tanking. And for the longest time, warrior tanks have been seen as not the best tank, as they're just very micromanagement heavy, but I really enjoyed the difficulty in terms of playing the specialization that needs a lot of high uptime compared to, let's say, Blood Death Knights and Demon Hunters, which are very popular in Legion. Anyway, without further ado, let's take a look at every single tank in the game. When it comes to Bear Druid, I found them very easy to do the rotation while moving. You're not particularly a fast class or a very mobile class, but your rotation is pretty simple. It comes down to 2 swipes, 1 single target ability, and that's really about it. And of course, you're gonna use some abilities for defenses, but your basic rotation to deal damage and hold threat is very simple. So moving around while using the AoE and or single target abilities is very easy, and I find it kind of interesting and nice. You also have fairly good crowd control. Not in terms of, variety of crowd control, but the knockback capability that allows you to knock the mobs back, which can interrupt them, can kind of move them out of, let's say, fire or anything that might buff them on the ground. I feel like that's actually kind of cool and a very unique CC for a lot of tanks. It's not the best AoE hold aggro in terms of out of all the tanks. One of the things that BFA is coming in with the tanks is less capability to hold aggro very easily. Most tanks just have to sneeze in the directional mobs, and they're just holding the most amount of aggro possible. In BFA, you're gonna have to try a little bit harder, and I felt like Guardian Druid on their own, without having to, without being able to grab certain abilities, certain talents in order to buff my damage to hold my aggro a little bit easier. Baseline, the spec didn't really bring a lot, so I feel like if you're gonna play a bear, you might need to run with a hunter or a rogue, which there's nothing bad about it, but it's kind of weird to have to rely on others for high amounts of aggro. I feel like Bear Druids, for the most part, had a fairly good self-heal. It's not like I really had to use it all that much, because I'm basically a wall of just meat and fat that the enemy cannot really burn through. But whenever I did need to heal myself, it felt pretty cool. It felt pretty reliable, and like as a heal over time, it's something I could kind of plan for. You also have a fairly decent range in terms of Boomy, as you can use Moonfire while in bear form to kind of tag enemies from afar. While some classes have those abilities on a cooldown, Boomies can kind of, Bear Druids I guess, which feel like a Boomy, can kind of just use it at a distance. Overall, I found Bear, I guess in terms of playstyle, a little bit boring. I didn't like the fact that my aggro, especially for AoE, wasn't really standing up on its own, and I felt like baseline, the specialization, I guess it was alright, but out of all the other specs, Bear Druid feels like a pretty good balance between all the other classes. As in, if you're not sure if you want to go for like Blood Death Knight, Paladin, Warrior, Demon Hunter, or Monk, and those classes have pretty good extremes of what they're really good at, I feel like Bear is pretty moderate at everything. So if you're not sure what tank you should play, I feel like Bear Druid satisfies all the elements other classes have, just not in a heavy, heavy commitment type of way, which is pretty good for a class that can do just about every single role and is pretty good at being a hybrid. Next class I was able to test was a Blood Death Knight. And I felt like Blood DK on its own was a very, very strong self-healer. In terms of if you just need to start healing yourself, I felt pretty reliable in terms of that. You also have very, very good AoE and aggro, as you have few abilities. One, an AoE, another, like a cleave capability, and then of course you have your Death and Decay that you can plop on the ground. Death and Decay with a talent actually can create an insane slow. So if you're running a bunch of enemies, grab them together all at the same time with Gorfian's Grasp, AoE them a bunch to really piss them off, to really get the aggro rolling, and then you could drop Death and Decay and run out of enemies, and they'll still have the aggro, but they'll move it just so slowly. I think that'll be a very, very cool, capability in terms of dungeons and Mythic Pluses, where let's say mobs get really, really angry and do a lot more damage. So for Death Knight, you pop defensives, stack them together, get the aggro, slow them down, let the DPS take care of them. So I really like that. It's not really a spammy tank compared to, let's say, a Bear Druid. Coming off of the Bear, I felt with the Demon Hunter or with Death Knight, I'm just spamming my abilities. Demon Hunter is another one where you kind of spam a lot of abilities. But I'm spamming my resources. I'm using up all my runes. I'm using up all my runic power, and I find myself kind of almost starved for runes. I realized very quickly that now with Blood Death Knights, I have to manage my runes compared to last time I got to play them. You gotta manage your runes and runic power, which feels actually pretty cool because it's a little more engaging. You have to be accurate with your resources. Like, don't get me wrong, you're a very, very tanky class, so you can take a lot of damage, but you have to be very, very careful not to, let's say, overdraw on too many bone shields, or just overdraw on too much runic power if you don't need to use it, you know, just for self-heal. It's very, very interesting specialization in terms of how micro you have to be a little bit with your resources and how you can be wasteful. I very much like that. Of course, Blood DK is not the most mobile tank in the game, so that is going to be one drawback on it, which I don't really mind it. I feel like mobility can be an asset for certain classes, but for Blood Death Knight, it feels like you're basically a human walking safe. You are really, really tough, really, really sturdy, and very, very difficult to crack into. And then we have the Paladin, and Paladin felt really, really cool. First of all, I love the fact that Paladin has so many utilities that can help out your team. Healing, that you can just kind of pop as long as you're standing in Consecration. It's actually very solid amounts of healing. Hands of Freedom to remove slows from friendlies. Stuns that you can throw out at enemies. A shield that has a silence effect to it and a bounce on top of it, so you can really stop a bunch of enemies from casting. Judgment that has a range capability. You have fairly decent AoE. You can dispel a lot of the poisons and diseases. I mean, the specialization feels like it's almost like another healer if you know how to play it properly. The Consecration also felt pretty cool to work with. They changed the mastery for Protection Paladins, where a lot of your defensive capability comes from Consecration, which is the holy aura shadow thing that you keep dropping on the ground. So you gotta get the enemies to stand there, as well as bosses to stand there. And if you're gonna move, you basically just gotta make sure if you're moving to drop it at the end of like where you want to move to. So planning ahead, let's say for Consecration, so you can drop it at a right position, I think it's gonna be very, very interesting and kind of full fun to work with. Also, I absolutely love healing about this class. The fact that you have self-heals, and like really, really solid self-heals. I feel like if you're able to pop defensives and manage your cooldown of your heal, you can actually escape certain situations. Although one thing I did not like about Protection Paladin is that every living thing is on a global cooldown. And sometimes when it comes to big pools, I mean, in a normal dungeon, it doesn't really feel all that scary. But I can imagine myself in a heroic or even in a mythic or in a raid situation where, you know, it gets a little bit more serious, that if I make just one bad move, where it's maybe be a choice of popping a defensives or popping a healing or trying to save an ally or trying to save yourself, then you might get the feeling like you just get locked out and you could just die any moment. So with Paladin, I don't like that feeling of where there's a lot of stress, a lot of pressure of trying to figure out the best possible move in the right moment. It feels like one of those classes that you kind of have to be, you know, playing for a while. You have to have been around the block with the Paladin in order to understand like when you should use certain abilities, when it's appropriate to pop a defensive, offensive, you know, to know the right answer to a situation. I think is going to be the skill cap, which I like, but also don't like because I'm just not used to it. So I'm never sure if I'm having the right decision or I'm trying even to make the right decision at the time. The next tank on the list is the Warrior, and that's the tank that I've been playing a little bit on Legion. And out of all the tanks I could be playing, I could have been playing a Blood Death Knight, could have been playing a Demon Hunter, could have even been playing a Protection Paladin, or even a Monk. But out of all the tanks, I think Protection Warrior ended up feeling, not, I won't say the worst tank, but definitely one of the hardest to pick up, because it's very micromanagement heavy. It's not really a tanky tank. You kind of just have to spam Ignore Pain and rotate between Shield Wall and Ignore Pain in order to stay tanky. So that means you're pressing your buttons a lot. So if you don't have any defensives, you fall over. So you kind of have to be, you know, always keeping that 90% damage reduction shield on you at all times. And that feels really, really weird. Anyway, the specialization feels really good in BFA. It's not as spammy. It's really just like a turtle. A turtle naturally comes with a hard shell, and so does the Warrior. You have absolutely no healing for the spec unless, let's say, you deal the killing blow to an enemy and then you can use Victory Rush to heal. But when it comes to like actual self-heals, this specialization has, well, basically none to start with. You can't just stop healing yourself. So that's going to be one drawback out of the Warrior, which is not a bad drawback at all. Because the rest of it, you're a strong defensive class. You have all the defenses in the world. You have so many varieties of ways of reducing damage, magical damage, physical damage, buffing your own health so you can take more damage, reducing the amount of damage the enemies take. I mean, there's so many ways of going about it with a fun cooldown reduction mechanic, which I actually love the fact that they're introducing cooldown reduction to a lot more classes in BFA. The GCD for the Warrior feels a lot similar to a Paladin, like it's kind of strict, but for the Warrior it feels more like a dance. Since you don't have to heal allies, you don't really have as many, let's say, utilities that you can provide to your team. The Warrior mostly focuses on trying to dish out as much damage as possible or trying to stay alive as best as possible. So the GCD ends up feeling a lot like a dance, and it feels like there's a lot less gaps in terms of defenses. As in, it's hard for me to, as a Warrior, whenever I'm playing and trying to, let's say, down a boss, it's hard for me to make a wrong decision, as there's a lot of abilities that just give me different defensives, and as long as I press something during my GCD that's a defensive, I should be just fine. Overall, it's a very, very solid tank, and I feel like if you're not sure what tank you should play, I think a Warrior, besides, you know, lack of healing, as long as you have a reliable healer, has very, very solid defenses and a variety of them. It's also very, very mobile as a tank, so if you need to get out of bad areas, charge as well as leap are great utilities. Overall, it's a very heavily defense focused, but I honestly feel that Warrior is better than it was in Legion. The next tank we'll talk about is the Demon Hunter tank, and this one didn't even feel like a tank. So the playstyle for Demon Hunter is hyper aggressive, as in, I was doing the dungeon and I didn't feel like a tank. I felt like a DPS character with 1 or 2 defensive spells and a bunch of sigils for utility. You could drop a sigil for AoE, which is fire damage. You have a sigil for a fear, so that's a pretty cool CC capability. You also have a big sigil for a blanket silence, so that's pretty cool. But past that, you're just kind of shredding at the enemies and trying to make them explode and dish out fire damage, and that's all you do. You don't really feel like a tank. You literally feel like a DPS. But like a DPS with a very, very simple rotation. So that was very, very interesting. And I originally tried out Demon Hunter tank and I very much liked it. But after a lot of changes that happened to a lot of these tank classes, Demon Hunter starts to feel a little bit shallow because you don't really have as big of a toolkit or utility in terms of, I guess, what you end up playing. Overall, you do feel like a tank. You are very, very tanky, but it feels like sometimes you're not trying to tank yourself up, you're just trying to out DPS the adds, because generally, the more damage you do to adds, with a few talents combined, the more healing you can get back for yourself. So instead of trying to tank up, you're just trying to burn the adds down ASAP, and you're one of the tanks that has probably some of the best AoE damage, so hold and threat should never be an issue. Overall, Demon Hunter tank, after playing all these tanks again, closer to like, you know, finish or BFA, where a lot of the tanks are at least more standardized, I have had a lot of changes done for them. Demon Hunters felt a little bit kind of out of place and weird. They're very, very light on making hard decisions though. A lot of these tanks sometimes feel like you're trying to make hard decisions in terms of what abilities you want to use. Do you want to use defensive, offensive, utility, you know? So there's a lot less critical thinking going on when it comes to Demon Hunter. You're taking damage, pop a defensive. You got enemies in front of you, just start mashing button 1. You got enough resource, mash button 2. You're talented to button 3, forget about 2, just hit 3. You got AoE going on, pop your AoE down. Enemies casting, kick them or silence them with a sigil. You know what I mean? It doesn't feel like a tank at all. It feels like you're trying to be a DPS with as many kicks as possible, as much CC as possible. And that's kind of how you end up feeling. See, for somebody who wants to play a straight up DPS with, I guess, passive tank capabilities, Demon Hunter as a tank actually felt really powerful and very, very reliable. It just didn't really give me that tank feeling at all. That was the weird part. And then finally, we have Monk tanks, and these guys are... They got a lot going on. First of all, probably one of the most mobile tanks in the game, even compared to Demon Hunters, and Demon Hunters and them are very, very close to each other. As a monk, it just felt like I'm just running all over the place. I'm never stopping. This specialization is the only spec of tanks that's just not affected by GCD. And I don't mean it's completely immune, it's just the way the Blizzard structured it. It's almost like a Fury Warrior that kind of takes the whole idea of GCD and says, yeah, I'm just going to kind of ignore that and just do my own thing type of deal. So the way that it plays is you have a DPS rotation, and it's basically 5 abilities that are fairly easy to use, and they have cooldown reductions off of each other, so they're up fairly often. So you're always going through this rotation of these abilities that are fairly in short cooldown. And then you have your defensive rotation, which are abilities that allow you to mitigate damage. So you might be using abilities 1 ability, 2 ability, 3 ability. But then while you're DPSing or while you're trying to get the aggro of mobs or of a boss, you'll be popping defenses kind of in between. So it can be like 1 damage ability defensive, 2nd damage ability, 2nd defensive, 1 ability. And it's not like big defensives, it's just basic mitigation of how you deal with damage. So it means that in the GCD, kind of like if you have a metronome, where most classes just kind of press an ability. Monks can kind of be like ability. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of abilities kind of getting fired all the same time, and it can feel like a mess. But if you hate the GCD, which a lot of tanks experience, then Monk might be the best tank for you. It also, this double rotation playstyle does feel like it's maybe a little bit too busy. I mean, I kind of like things that are this busy. I like how there's a lot of things going on, but I feel that if you're not that good at this kind of like busy work in terms of what's going on with the tank, as well as the mechanic of defensive, which is a little bit on the weirder side compared to some of the other tanks, it might make a, let's say, a newer player kind of just be overwhelmed with a lot of things, and then you stop stop paying attention to the mobs, you stop paying attention to the mechanics, you maybe will try to play up to your rotation, and then the boss just smacks you in the face and just one-shots you. The whole defensive mechanic is a little bit different from other tanks. While a lot of other tanks just have defensive increase, like, okay, I'm just taking less damage, that's it. Some of them might have defensive increase, but you also are self-healing yourself from doing damage, like Blood Death Knight and Demon Hunter. Monk's a little bit weird. They will take a portion of a hit they take to the face, and that portion of a hit won't disappear. They don't reuse the damage. That portion of a hit simply turns into damage over time ability afterwards. But that damage over time stacks up. So you can increase your threshold of how much of a hit gets absorbed into this damage over time, but you're not getting immune from this ability. You're not getting immune from this damage over time. It just ticks on you a little bit later, and that can basically overwhelm a lot of players and feel like you're gonna snowball on. So the defensive part of the playstyle ends up increasing the threshold at which you stagger, which is the mechanic, stagger all the damage into a dot, and then another ability that also shares a cooldown with the stagger ability, where you throw this dot and reduce it. You reduce how much you take. So you basically have a bunch of rotations going on. So if a fight has a lot of busy mechanics, I couldn't imagine for somebody who's not experienced with Monk to maybe make a fatal mistake. And overall, they didn't feel like the most tankiest tank. I mean, they felt pretty good in terms of the stagger mechanic, but I feel like with so much going on, I feel like it's one of those tanks that just feels like it's very, very easy to make a mistake, and it's very easy to get one shot by the boss if you miss a beat, because there's a lot going on in terms of the spec. Alright, I talked about every single tank in as much detail as was necessary. Overall, I think I made my list. I think I want to put at the very, very top, like one of the best tanks that felt really good. I honestly felt Monk was there. You know, it's very, very busy, and for anybody who's a new player, I don't know if Monk will be the best, but if you're somebody who's a seasoned player and you're just not happy with the GCD that's happening in BFA, I think the Monk would be the way to kind of offset it. There's a lot going on, so if you're somebody who wants to have, you know, be very, very engaged and have like a very, very busy playstyle, I feel like Monks would definitely be there. I think in the second spot, I would have to put the Demon Hunter. I mean, that hyper-aggressive playstyle just felt actually so unique. It didn't really feel like a tank. It's kind of like my joy for playing Discipline Priest, where I deal damage to heal, rather than playing Holy, where I heal to heal. So I like that whole capability, I guess. And I feel like Demon Hunters are just a very, very strong tank right now because of, you know, they don't have any defensives that they have to play up to. For them, it's going to be a lot easier to pay attention to mechanics. Being a mobile class, you know, fairly simple rotation, very hyper-aggressive, so you don't have to watch out for defensives. It will be very, very easy for them to manage the cooldowns, manage the fight, and manage the damage that comes at them, and then try to deal with it as best as possible. I think the third best tank I would put on here is probably the Warrior. I mean, it's a class with not a lot of self-healing, but it's just a... I mean, it's just a tank. It's just a turtle. I mean, there's just a lot of going on there. I very, very much liked it, and I thought it was really, really cool. I just like the defensive nature of the Warrior, just how little damage you take, and the playstyle with GCD ended up feeling really, really good. Like, it felt like a dance, so it didn't feel like, you know, it was a little bit wonky. In the fourth tank, I probably would put Paladin just because it has so many cool utilities. I love what the Paladin brings to the table, and I love the potential behind it. But I feel like the whole GCD aspect, I feel I would get so frustrated if I were to try to heal or try to play defensive, and that whole, you know, if I make the bad move, if I spend the global cooldown and I press the wrong ability, I might just not even be able to forgive myself. I would just feel so terrible, because that's kind of like where the difficulty of the specialization comes in. I love the amount of utility they have. I just wish maybe like healing was off GCD or something, so it'd be a lot more reactive. I think the next tank I would put on here is Blood Death Knight. I don't hate the Blood DK. I thought it was a very, very strong and good class. I just didn't think it was quite as unique as some of the other ones. Blood Death Knights, I think, are going to be a very, very strong class in the future. Some people have said they kind of have fallen and they're not as good as they are right now. And right now they're pretty popular when it comes to raids and mostly Mythic Plus dungeons. But I feel like they're going to be a good tank no matter what. It just, I feel like they didn't have as many busy and cool things going on as a Paladin, Warrior, Demon Hunter, or Monk. And at the very end, I would have to put the Bear, mostly because the Bear is a good medium tank in terms of I can do a little bit of everything, but it doesn't really specialize in one thing that you can really be good at. So for Bears, they're not quite the most mobile tank, let's say. They're not quite the tank with the most amount of defensives. They're not quite the tank with the most amount of healing. They're not quite the tank with, you know, the craziest damage, but they have AoE. They have a fair amount of damage. They have healing. They have some range capability. They have a fair amount of aggro. They have a fair amount of cooldowns. So if you're not sure if you want to commit to a Warrior or a Paladin or a Blood DK, I feel like a Bear Druid might be able to fulfill majority of their aspects, just not expertly, you know, at a moderate level. But I'm somebody who kind of likes to either go in or go home, so I feel like a Bear Druid just wouldn't fit me at all. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. I was happy to bring you guys this one. I'm not somebody who is a tank main, so I wasn't sure exactly how should I approach the situation or how much research should I do. So I decided to go off of the feel, off of how these classes play. I am going to take Blizzard at the word, as I said, that we're going to try to homogenize things, so they're a lot closer. So we'll just take Blizzard at the word. I feel like by the time, maybe by patch 8.1, we'll see the fruits of the labor if we don't see it in the opener. But I'm excited to try a bunch of different tanks in my groups. I'm excited to tricks a bunch of tanks as a rogue. And I think it'll be very, very fun to see which tank ends up being the best. Because I feel like there was going to be the best tank for raids, dungeons, and maybe even one for PvP. Thank you so much for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed. Let me know which thought down below. Which tank do you think is the best in your opinion, and which one would you rather play? Thank you so much for watching. I'll see all of you in the next one.